Today's webinar is presented in partnership with the National Immigration Law Center. Shelby Gonzales, Director of Immigration Policy here at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, is joined by Gabrielle Lessard, Senior Policy Attorney at the National Immigration Law Center. They will cover information about concerns immigrants and their families may have as they make decisions about enrollment in marketplace coverage, Medicaid, or CHIP. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shelby.
I'm Shelby Gonzales, and I really want to thank Ina for having me here today. I always think it's great to be part of this training ahead of open enrollment. I get super excited about open enrollment, and I want to thank everyone who's listening to this presentation today, not only because I know that so many of you are just super dedicated to your communities and helping people enroll in marketplace coverage, and that is something that's really, really near and dear to my heart. But in particular, that you logged in to listen to this webinar's content. We have really important information about some of the challenges that face immigrants and their families as they are seeking health coverage. And we really greatly appreciate the work that you all have done and will continue to do to help people better understand what their options are and how it interacts with other aspects of their life, including what their family's immigration goals might be. So I want to get us started by taking a pause for a second and kind of stating something that I think probably doesn't really need to be stated in many ways. But many immigrants in the United States and their families have experienced a lot of fear and confusion over the last few years. This is especially true within this kind of world of health benefit programs, because there have been some immigration policies that have been under development. And the immigration policy in particular that we're going to talk about today is often referred to as the public charge policy, or you might have heard people say the public charge rule. And as that immigration policy has been radically changed over the last few years and has been in different stages of development and then implementation more recently, there's been a lot of media attention about it. And there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of families, a lot of individuals are just very, very confused about it and are fearful about these changes. So our hope today is to kind of clarify what the policy the policy is today. And our hope is that you'll come away with a clearer picture to better understand what the policy does and does not do, so that when people come to you and maybe are fearful of the policy, you can either provide them information that can help clarify some misperceptions and or refer them to other sources to get additional help. So I want to pause and just take a deep breath for a second and just kind of go through some takeaways that I hope that you get from this webinar. And one is that accessing the Affordable Care Act's premium tax credits and cost sharing reductions to enroll in marketplace plans is not something that can later on be a harmful thing that is looked at in immigration policy when somebody's going through a public charge assessment in the future. The same is true for enrollment in the Children's Health Insurance Program. Those are programs, the two benefits that I just talked about, the cost sharing reductions and premium tax credits to make ACA marketplace more affordable and CHIP, are not programs that have been listed in the new public charge rules that would potentially be negatively factored into a public charge assessment. So right from the start, there's some reassuring messages that you can provide to individuals that look like they're going to enroll and be eligible for one of those programs. The second thing I want you to think about and come away from is that in this new set of policies that reimagine how public charge is done, it is actually a helpful factor. It's something that looks positive in your favor when you have health insurance. That is a good thing for somebody to have when they are going through a public charge assessment. And then the other thing I want you to come away with is that there's a lot of people who are eligible for Medicaid, but because of the way that the eligibility requirements are written and implemented in Medicaid, which really restrict a lot of people from being eligible for Medicaid based off of their immigration status, because it's so restrictive. And we have a whole nother webinar that Gabrielle and I did, a couple of weeks back that can give you all that information. But because of the immigration, restrictions are so severe, right? It's difficult to be an immigrant who's lawfully in the U.S. and yet still qualified to get Medicaid coverage. So because that is so strict, very few people who are eligible for Medicaid's very restrictive requirements are later on going to go through a public charge assessment in the future and have Medicaid be a factor that could be negative towards them. And that's, again, because of the general eligibility rules. And then there's also some exceptions to, while Medicaid might be, while somebody who's going through a public charge assessment under the new rules, Medicaid is something that could be looked into. There's a lot of exceptions. And like one of them that is very, very big is that a person who gets Medicaid, who is 21 or younger, or under 21, that Medicaid participation is not going to be a negative factor in a public charge assessment. So while there are some cases when children could potentially, meet the immigration eligibility requirements depending on what state they live in, because they're children and they fit under this under 21 exception, even they are not likely to go through or be harmed in a public charge assessment. So I know that this is a lot to kind of say without going into the details, but I just wanted to put these things out there so that you can, to help frame what you're going to be hearing as we start to dive in deeper into each of these kinds of concepts and about what public charge really looks like under the new rules. So the last thing, just to kind of put this all together, is that even after everything I just said, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to forego accessing public benefit programs out of fear and confusion than who would ever really have a negative immigration consequence because of accessing those benefit programs. And that's why we think that this information that we're going to be providing, that Gabrielle will be providing today, is so important, because we need to help families, help individuals to kind of understand why, the fear, when they should not have any fear, and help to clarify this confusion. And, probably more important than ever, given the fact that we are in a pandemic, and given the fact that so many people are struggling financially at this moment because of the economic challenges that our country is facing, we want to make sure that people aren't going without benefit programs, specifically these health benefit programs that we're going to focus in on today, out of just fear and misinformation. So we think that you have an important role to play in this, but we don't want you to come away thinking that we have an expectation, or that you should have your own expectation for yourself in any way, that you're going to come away from this becoming an immigration policy expert. Immigration policy is complicated, it's hard. So that's not the bar that we're trying to, meet today. And we don't think that you should try to, well, if you want to go to, law school or, then go ahead, that's great. But we're not trying to have us all become, immigration policy experts. Rather, we're going to try and distill some important, relevant information that is likely to be helpful to you as you work with individuals during this open enrollment season. We also don't think that, that you should feel responsible for telling somebody that, yes, you're safe. And yes, you should enroll. People need to make those decisions for themselves. We're going to give you the information that's needed, and you can provide them information and resources, and people can make their own decisions. So, what role can you play? How can you help families? Again, you can help by providing some factual information to consumers. We are going to be linking to some good resources that were developed by NILC, with the organization that Gabrielle works for, as well as the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign that has created wonderful documents that help clarify these rules. And we also think that you can take other steps, including things like referring people to other experts when necessary. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabrielle. And again, thank Gabrielle very much for participating in this webinar today and helping us better understand what public charge means and how it works, and helping us to correct misperceptions and help people better understand what this means for them and their families as they're considering what their health coverage options are. Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thanks, Shelby. Hello, everyone from Los Angeles. Next slide, please. Okay, so public charge has actually been part of federal immigration law since the late 1800s. It's one of the oldest parts of immigration law. A person who is deemed to be likely to become a public charge can be denied permission to come to the United States. That's on either an immigrant or a non-immigrant visa. And it's a determination made by consular officers who work for the State Department at US consuls around the world. A person who is deemed to be likely to be a public charge can also be denied lawful permanent resident status, LPR status, which is often referred to as getting a green card. Important to know that it is not an eligibility factor for enrollment in public health insurance or coverage programs. And that for many years, immigration law defined a public charge as a person who was primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. In 2019, the Department of Homeland Security published proposed regulations that went into effect in 2020 that define a public charge as a person who receives certain public benefits for 12 months in the aggregate out of a 36-month period. One of the things that makes that definition particularly complicated is that the months of benefits are aggregated in a way that if a person received 2 benefits in a month, that would count as 2 months of benefits. 3 benefits in a month would count as 3 months. So it's a complex rule. Next slide. So what benefits are considered? Cash assistance for income maintenance has been part of the test for a long time. This is cash assistance that is intended to meet the person's day-to-day living expenses. This is considered at any time, including before the new regulations went into effect. And it is cash assistance from any level of government, federal, state, or local programs, including a program like a county general relief fund. Additional benefits were added by the regulations, which went into effect on February 24th of this year. Those include SNAP, which was formerly food stamps, Section 8, both Section 8 housing choice vouchers and project-based Section 8 assistance, public housing, and Medicaid with some important exceptions. Medicaid for medical emergencies does not count. As Shelby mentioned earlier, Medicaid received by people who are under the age of 21 does not count. No health assistance programs received by people under 21 count. Medicaid received during pregnancy and for 60 days after the end of pregnancy. And then there are other exceptions that apply primarily to people with connections to active military service or international adoption. Next slide. Now, one of the things that makes public charge particularly complicated, oh, next slide. Go back one slide, please. One of the things that makes public charge particularly complicated is that it's a forward-looking assessment. I still need to go back one slide, Kyle. You seem to be missing a slide. Okay. So one of the things that makes public charge complicated is that it's a forward-looking assessment. The person who is conducting the public charge assessment is actually considering whether, based on their current circumstances and characteristics, the person in front of them is likely to become a public charge at some point in the future. The law requires that person to consider different factors in a test that's referred to as the totality of the circumstances test. Those factors are the person's age, health, income and financial resources, their family status, including how many dependents they have, their skills and work experience, and then if they are a family-based immigrant who's required to have an affidavit of support from a sponsor, whether they actually have a legally sufficient affidavit of support. Now, you'll notice that benefits don't show up anywhere in this law. Benefits are considered as an indication of the person's financial status. A person does not have to have actually received any benefits to be deemed to be likely to become a public charge. Next slide. So who is subject to the, oh, all messed up here. Benefits that are not considered are benefits that are used by anybody in the household other than the person who is applying for the visa, permission to come to the US, or for permanent resident status. This is true even if the applicant submitted the application on behalf of another person, for example, a parent applying on behalf of their children. Other benefits that are not considered are short-term or special purpose cash benefits. The only cash assistance that counts is that cash assistance that's intended to pay day-to-day living expenses. Notably, disaster assistance is not included. State and local non-cash benefits are also not included. WIC, school meals, services received at community health centers, including services that are assisted by a sliding fee scale payment, hospital charitable or financial assistance, and anything else that is not explicitly listed in the regulations. Next slide. Okay, so who is subject to the public charge test? Public charge primarily affects people who are seeking an immigration status based on family relationships. Many people come here for humanitarian reasons or receive a status based on humanitarian reasons. And those people are exempt from the public charge grounds of inadmissibility. These include refugees, people granted asylum, people who have received or applied for a T visa as a survivor of human trafficking, people who have received or applied for a U visa as a victim of another kind of serious crime. Many survivors of domestic violence, including people who are petitioning for their own status under the Violence Against Women Act, and special immigrant juveniles who are kids who are abandoned or have been abused so badly they're deemed to be abandoned. There is a comprehensive list of all of these exemptions in the regulations, as well as in the instructions for Form I-944, which is the form that a person submits to demonstrate that they are not likely to become a public charge. Next slide. Okay, so when is public charge assessed? So people who are not exempt undergo the public charge assessment when they are, again, at a consular office outside the United States seeking permission to come to the US, or when they are applying to become a lawful permanent resident or to get a green card, which is a very important step in the immigration process. It is when people can really feel secure that they are able to remain permanently in the United States, to make it their permanent home, to remain here with their family members. And getting the LPR status is the last step before citizenship. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that one of the conditions of maintaining your LPR status is that you reside permanently in the United States. If a person leaves the US for over 6 months, they may be deemed to have abandoned that residency and could be assessed for public charge when they return. Some examples of times when no public charge test is required are when a person who has already obtained permanent resident status applies for citizenship, when a person who has permanent resident status renews their green card. It's just a document that expires, not their status. And then when a person who immigrated through a spouse applies to remove conditions on their LPR status. Conditional LPR status is something that is unique to that spousal immigration. Next slide. All right, let's look at an example. So we remember Ricky, Ava, and Karina from our last webinar, but their status has changed. Ricky became a lawful permanent resident 6 years ago. Ava has a student visa, and Karina was born here, and she is a US citizen. Next slide. So who is likely to undergo a public charge assessment? So Ava is going to be seeking to obtain LPR status, and she is likely to undergo a public charge assessment at that time. Ricky is seeking to become a US citizen. There is no public charge assessment as part of the citizenship or naturalization application process. And Karina, of course, is already a citizen, so public charge does not apply to her. But we do need to remember for Ricky that if he leaves the US for more than 6 months, then he may go through a public charge assessment when he returns to the country. Next slide. All right, let's go one more. Okay, so what about benefits access? So Karina, or Ava, as a person who does not yet have permanent resident status, is going to be receiving her health care through the marketplace. She does not have a status that makes her eligible for Medicaid. So are marketplace benefits factored in the public charge assessment? They are not, even if the person receives financial assistance through the marketplace. Will Ricky be subject to a public charge assessment? Possibly if he leaves the country for more than 6 months. As a permanent resident, he is eligible for Medicaid, so that because he is an adult and as far as we know, not pregnant, that is a benefit that would be factored in the public charge assessment. And Karina, even though she is in either Medicaid or CHIP, will not be subject to a public charge assessment because she is a US citizen. If she were not a citizen, however, her use of healthcare benefits would be exempt because she's under 21. Next slide. Okay, things that people should think about. As Shelby said earlier, a lot of people are avoiding benefits out of concerns related to public charge. But things that people should think about in really weighing that risk are whether they're even eligible for health coverage through Medicaid that would not be exempt from public charge. And if so, are they a person who is likely to undergo a public charge assessment? Are they somebody who already has their permanent resident status and intends to continue to remain in the United States, or somebody who is in one of the many humanitarian statuses that exempt them from public charge? And then if they do feel that that presents a risk, what would be the countervailing risk of going without sufficient health coverage or other kinds of assistance like food and housing? What would that mean for their family, for their health, and for their financial status? And then again, if they are going to undergo a public charge assessment, would the health coverage they're eligible to receive be of a type that is taken into account? Next slide. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Shelby here.
Thank you. Gabrielle, we're going to pause and take a few questions for you before I go ahead and start talking a little bit about some concerns that immigrants and their families might have when applying for health coverage.
Sounds good.
Ina, do we have some questions lined up?
We do have questions. Thanks, Shelby. The first question is, can you briefly explain how the public charge experience might be different for a person applying for an immigration status from outside of the US?
Okay, currently, the regulations that govern public charge determinations outside of the United States, which are the State Department regulations, have been put on hold by the courts. So a person who was applying outside of the country would be assessed to determine whether, based on their current characteristics, they would be deemed to become likely to become a public charge in the future, defined as primarily dependent on the government for support, as shown by the receipt of cash assistance for income maintenance. If those regulations go into effect, the process would be very similar for people applying inside or outside of the United States. However, the Form I-944, which I referred to earlier, which is the Department of Homeland Security form for assessing whether a person is likely to become a public charge, is an 18-page form which requires a great deal of supplementary documentation. The State Department form, even though it's attempting to elicit the same information, is much simpler and does not require the same kind of documentation. So it would be a more straightforward assessment.
Thank you for that.
Gabrielle, can I just quick follow-up? What do we know in terms of people and how, I mean, are there a lot of people who are actually going through public charge assessments at the moment abroad? Or are they also facing kind of some backlogs or other barriers given the pandemic or other kind of administrative actions that have been happening? Do we have any?
Great question. There have been several pandemic-related travel bans, so that at this point in time, we believe that there may be no visa applications processed, or if there are, they're very slow.
Thank you.
Great. We do have a couple more questions that came in. The first question is, will this assessment be conducted for immigrants adjusting their status from LPR to USC?
No. Once a person has become a lawful permanent resident, when they apply to naturalize and become a US citizen, they don't have to go through another public charge assessment.
And is every U visa holder exempt from the public charge assessment, or does it depend on the type of crime?
No, U visa holders are categorically exempt.
Great. And as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll be stopping for questions once more at the end. Back to you, Shelby.
There are a few more questions in the queue, and I'm wondering if, since we do have a little bit of time, if we could go ahead and answer a couple of them. Would that be okay?
Of course.
Do you want me to read one of them?
Oh, I'm happy to do it.
Okay.
What is the difference between Section 8 and public housing?
Public housing is usually run by a public housing authority. That can be a statewide or local body. And Section 8 comes in two forms. One is a subsidy that is generally provided to private nonprofit developers of affordable housing. And then the second is a voucher that a person can actually take out to landlords in the community that provides a supplement to their rent payment.
Great. And is a person who has a legal disability in another country subject to the public charge rule?
I'm not sure what a legal disability means, so I'm going to take that as a disability as we commonly understand it. There is no exemption to the public charge rule for people with disabilities.
Can you clarify whether someone who is an LPR that received LPR status through sponsorship is eligible to apply for their family for CalFresh without it affecting their sponsor?
So CalFresh is the SNAP program in California. Currently, California does not pursue repayment of public benefits from sponsors. It is technically legally able to do that, but it is not doing that currently.
And it would be if the state were to opt to do that, it would be subject to many restrictions before they would be able to do that. So, you know, for example, under certain conditions, if the individual, him or herself, that's been sponsored and who's participating in SNAP meets certain certain requirements that would show that they are, you know, facing some very difficult situations, which, by the way, a lot of people who meet them SNAP qualifications would meet, then they would not be able to apply, you know, that liability, you know, going after. So there are certain restrictions on whether or not you could go. I'm doing a poor job of describing it, but the bottom line here is that even if a state were implementing some what we call sponsor liability, in other words, trying to seek out some reimbursement for from a person who sponsored an immigrant, they would have to do that under some other constraints. It's not like everybody who has a sponsor would be liable.
Yeah, and also the state is legally required to deem a portion of the sponsor's income as available to the sponsored immigrant when they apply for that benefit, unless certain exceptions apply. And that often makes the person ineligible.
Yeah. So.
And we received a couple of requests asking you to please repeat the information about permanent residents applying for citizenship and whether the public charge rule applies to them.
Okay, once a person has become a permanent resident, when they apply to naturalize or become a citizen, there is no public charge test as part of that application process.
Great. So we will pause once more at the end for questions. I know we have a couple more left, but we'll continue with the presentation and then stop one more time at the end.
Okay. Thank you, Ina, and thank you, Gabrielle. So there are clearly some concerns that people have when they are applying for different health coverage. And part of it, it has to do with some of the requests for information that are made. And Kyle, by the way, I can't access the controls, so I'm going to go ahead and just tell you when to, oh, now I can, I guess. Hold on. Sorry. Okay, now I can. All right. Thank you, Kyle. Okay, so there are certain concerns that people have when they're going through the application process. And there's some information that, you know, we want to share with you so that you can help people navigate those concerns. So first, some people who are either themselves immigrants or have immigrants in their families, they're worried that if they complete an application, they're going to be asked to provide and disclose information about the immigration status or lack thereof, you know, not having an immigration status of other individuals in the household who they themselves are not seeking out benefit programs. So a common example of that would be like, maybe you have mom and dad who are applying for Medicaid or marketplace coverage for their child. And their child is a US born citizen, and maybe mom has LPR status and maybe dad has DACA, and maybe dad does not want to disclose his DACA status on an application. So that's kind of an example that you might see oftentimes when we have individuals within one family where there's different immigration statuses or citizenship statuses. We refer to them as mixed status families. You may have heard that term used a bunch. And that's kind of an example of that. There are some privacy rules that really come into play that are really important for families that really want to make sure that the information that they provide in applications is being utilized only for the purposes of making an eligibility determination, and that protect against them having to disclose information like immigration status of individuals who are not applying for coverage for themselves, right? So these rules help protect against people being forced to disclose this kind of irrelevant information within the applications. So we've included some citations here where it shows in the regulations where some of these constraints live, which sometimes can be helpful if you're finding that you're in a situation where an application, or maybe the way that the application is being, the information is being collected sometimes through the call center, or maybe an online application is requesting a consumer to provide information that's not necessary for the application, including things like, in that example that I gave of mom and dad who aren't applying for coverage for themselves, but they are applying for coverage for their child. Mom and dad should not be required to disclose their immigration status in that application. It's not relevant to the eligibility determination. Now, mom and dad are going to have to provide other information, including information about their income, right? And other pieces of information like that. So oftentimes what we refer to as people like that mom and dad that I described in that, we refer to them as non-applicants. And so an applicant is a person who's trying to get, who is completing the application, trying to see if they can get enrolled to be determined eligible in the different benefit programs like Medicaid, CHIP, and marketplace coverage. And the non-applicants are part of the household, mom and dad in that example that I gave, but not seeking benefits for themselves. And again, the non-applicants do not have to share information about them and about themselves. And different applications go about this in different ways. We provided here kind of the way that healthcare.gov has done this, at least this is the way that it's done it in the past. It will ask, who is applying for health coverage. It will have already asked you as a person, the individual who's applying for somebody in their family, there's information like, tell me yourself, add information about yourself, about, husband or spouse or, whatever in your family, and children or other information. And then here they'll populate the people that you have included in your household. And then they'll give you an opportunity to identify who is going to be applying for health coverage. And then when you add the people, then those are the individuals who are going to be asked more detailed information that is required as part of the application process to make a determination of eligibility. There are some strict rules around inquiring about Social Security numbers, so requesting Social Security numbers in applications. And for people who they themselves are applying for Medicaid or CHIP, SSN, Social Security numbers, are generally required. They're going to be asked to provide a Social Security number, but coverage cannot be denied or delayed while the Social Security number is pending. So if the person otherwise appears to be eligible for Medicaid, there are a lot of reasons why somebody might not have a Social Security number. And for example, newborn babies, right? A newborn baby does not have a Social Security number right away. That newborn baby cannot be denied or have its Medicaid coverage delayed while the family is undergoing the process to get a Social Security number issued for the baby, right? So a Medicaid agency must also say that it would be happy to help or that it would provide assistance in getting a Social Security number. And then there are some applicants, so people who they themselves are seeking coverage for themselves, and yet they do not have to provide a Social Security number. And that includes, like the newborn example, right? They're in the process of obtaining a social security number, so the newborns. There are people who have religious objections to social security numbers. And then there are certain individuals who they meet the immigration related requirements to enroll in Medicaid, and they do not have access to a social security number, or they can only get a social security number that is for non-work purposes. So in those cases, those individuals do not have to provide a social security number, and their application cannot be denied because of not providing it, or delayed because of not providing a social security number. So I saw a question come in the chat, or the question piece of what happens in this case, right? Because there are certain people, especially in states that have less restrictive immigration related requirements for children or pregnant women, which is a state option. So there are certain immigrants who don't have social security numbers, who are lawfully present, who meet the immigration related requirements to enroll in Medicaid, but they don't have a social security number, and the state cannot deny them eligibility based off of that. And if that does happen, then that is an example of a time when you want to appeal the eligibility determination that was wrongful. In the marketplace, only applicants who have social security numbers are required to provide one. So again, if somebody doesn't have a social security number for a variety of reasons, and we gave some already in the examples when we talked about Medicaid and CHIP, they do not need to provide one, even if they are an applicant. I'm having trouble with this, with the controls, I'm so sorry. Okay, so non-applicants. So again, we talked about many times there are individuals on the application because they are not they themselves applying for health insurance for themselves. And in Medicaid and CHIP, somebody who is not applying for health insurance for him or herself never has to provide a social security number as an eligibility requirement for other individuals who are seeking Medicaid or CHIP in the application. So in other words, if mom and dad are non-applicants in the application and they're applying for Medicaid or CHIP for their child, they do not have to provide a social security number. They can skip that question, and they will be asked for their social security number, and sometimes they'll be asked for it several times. If you encounter a situation where you can't advance in the application without providing a social security number, that is a serious problem, and hopefully that's no longer happening. Many years ago we saw that as a problem in online applications. It was an error, and states have come a long way in fixing that. But you should alert us if you see that, you run into that. And also, because that is something that should be addressed. Marketplaces. So non-applicant household members should not be required to provide social security numbers unless all of the following are true. So all of these things would have to be true before a non-applicant would be required to provide a social security number. So the non-applicant is a tax filer. And the non-applicant has a social security number. So if the non-applicant does not have a social security number, that you stop right there. They are not required to provide one. The non-applicant filed a federal tax return in the past year. So you see, there's a lot that would have to happen and line up before a person would be required to provide a social security number in the application. So I want to pause there, and I want to say that, in the examples, or while non-applicants are generally not, required to provide social security numbers, as I've just talked about, in these programs, right? at times it might benefit people to provide the social security numbers. And like I said, they're going to ask for the social security numbers. The hope is that for people who don't want to provide the social security number for a variety of reasons, or don't have a social security number, the hope is that the application allows them to continue forward, and we definitely want to hear about it if it's not. But if they have a social security number that was issued to them, and they don't mind providing it in the application, sometimes it will help to avoid the need to then provide evidence of, things like income for the family, right? Because what happens is that the social security number would be used, a social security number that is provided by, for example, those parents that I keep on giving as the example, even though they're non-applicants, they're not going to be, we're not going to use social security number for the purposes of figuring out whether or not, they're citizens, but the social security number would be utilized to check and see whether or not there's electronic data available that can be used to verify income, for example, either through like the tax or maybe through work number or other databases that are utilized to check on income. But again, if a person doesn't have a social security number, then they should not feel forced to provide one. Or if a person feels that they don't want to disclose this information for a variety of reasons, people feel very uneasy about. I feel uneasy anytime I go to the doctor and they want my social security number. I don't like providing my social security number unless I'm legally obligated to do so. And I think that there are a growing number of people who feel that way. So again, we definitely don't want people feeling like they have to provide a number that is not correct, that's not theirs, or that, or another number. Like, for example, maybe there are a lot of people who, if they don't have a social security number, they file their federal taxes using what is referred to as an I-10. People shouldn't feel like they need to put that number into the application either. So that's that on social security numbers. I'm really struggling with the slides today. I don't know why advancing them seems really strange to me today. Okay, so just want to close by offering some tips and suggestions about talking about immigration status, because it is a sensitive topic, right? It's not something that we go around asking people about on a regular basis. And we know, as we started off this conversation today, right, this whole webinar, is that there's been a lot of fear among immigrants and their family members, for a variety of reasons. So people don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about their immigration status. So, we offer these as tips to help you to gather the right information that you absolutely need to help somebody complete the application without, without like making the whole situation super awkward, or by accident maybe collecting the wrong information because it's an awkward set of questions. So the first thing is that we shouldn't ask any non-applicant to disclose their citizenship or immigration status. So even if you have, so let's say you have mom and dad, that we keep on going back to as an example, they're applying for their child to get coverage. We wouldn't want to say, well, why don't you guys want to get coverage? Are you undocumented? Like, that would feel uncomfortable potentially for somebody, right? Like, they wouldn't, we would let them, if they say we're applying for just our child, enough said. That's their decision. And we're going to go ahead and proceed with the application for their child, right? We're not going to dig in deeper to find out more about their status, even if the application is not what is inspiring it. Then using some broad questions and share general information about immigrant eligibility to help people identify who may want to apply for coverage. So what you could do in that same example, right, is we have all of those charts that we used in the last webinar that Gabrielle and I did with you, that lists all of the different kind of immigration statuses that would make somebody eligible for either Medicaid or for the marketplace coverage. Well, showing them those charts and saying, well, you know, these are people who meet these requirements, have any of these statuses, might be eligible for marketplace coverage, and then let them look at them, see, and then they can disclose what they would like and make their decision on their own as to whether or not they want to apply. When asking questions about immigration or citizenship status of people who are applying for coverage for themselves, again, we would have want to avoid anything like having some, we wouldn't want to say, are you undocumented or not legally in the US? You know, instead we would say words like, do you have an eligible immigration status or status eligible for marketplaces? And again, you can use those lists of all of those statuses and say, these are the statuses that would qualify somebody. Do you see your status in one of these? Like, that is the approach, rather than just asking somebody if they're undocumented or not legally in the US. So with that, I'm going to share some of the resources. Like I mentioned, NILC has some amazing resources that really help put a lot of this very complicated information into understandable terms and information, as well as the Protecting Immigrant Families resources and Kaiser resources as well. And I am going to turn it, I'm going to turn it back over to Ina, who's going to preview our next webinar and then take some additional questions. And I do want to just mention that we do have contact information at the end of the webinar. And, you know, please reach out to us if you have additional questions or the Beyond the Basics. Ina?
Thanks, Shelby. We had a couple of questions come in about premium tax credits and enrolling in marketplace coverage. Are those factored into public charge assessments and considered negative factors?
No, they are not factored into public charge as a negative factor. And in fact, having health insurance through the marketplace is a positive factor in the public charge assessment.
Are individuals with DACA status subject to public charge?
People with DACA are not exempt from public charge. However, people who have DACA are generally not eligible to adjust their status to become permanent residents. So they would have to have some other vehicle, for example, marrying a citizen. And if that vehicle, for example, marrying a citizen, was not exempt from public charge, then they would be.
And could you explain a bit more about sponsors in public charge? The question asker said that they've had clients who say they won't apply for a marketplace plan because that puts their sponsor at risk of paying money down. So
having a sponsor is a positive factor in the public charge test. For most family-based immigrants, it is required that you have a sponsor, but marketplace plans or financial assistance are not considered negative factors in the public charge test, and sponsors cannot be required to pay anything for their sponsored immigrants marketplace plans.
And what if someone has no immigration status and wants to apply for marketplace coverage? What kind of proof would they need to provide?
So people need to be lawfully present to apply for marketplace coverage, and they would provide a document that they received at the time that they received their status. And that could be a card, it could be a stamp of their passport, it could be a court decision or a receipt. It's not necessarily just an ID card, but those documents have codes that indicate the individual's status. On our website, which I'll put into the chat, nilc.org, we have a chart of different documents that immigrants in different statuses commonly have.
Yeah, and just to mention, the way that the applications in general are set up are they will ask somebody if they have an eligible immigration status, and not always artfully asked this way, by the way, just to make sure that everyone knows, but generally a question will be asked and they will provide oftentimes a link to a set of statuses that would make somebody lawfully present. And then they would ask the individual to provide a number, you know, they would give them a drop down, you know, or somehow options about different documents that they might have, and that people would have you know, that prove their status. And then the individual would select one of the documents that they have, and then they would ask them to provide some specific numbers from that document. So that's generally kind of the flow of how the application seeks that information. And then that information is then shared with an electronic government database. And then oftentimes people can have that process be what verifies their immigration status for the purpose of enrollment and marketplace coverage. Sometimes it doesn't work, and then people are asked to provide evidence like a document, you know, to upload an image of a document that then would oftentimes clear up that kind of issue and satisfy the verification requirement.
Thank you so much, Shelby and Gabrielle. Really appreciate all of this valuable information. As a reminder, we'll be distributing the materials from today's session via email, and we'll post everything to the Beyond the Basics website at www.healthreformbeyondthebasics.org. The last part of this webinar series, covering best practices for helping people with disabilities enroll into health coverage, is scheduled for next Thursday, October 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. You can register for upcoming webinars on the Beyond the Basics website under upcoming webinars. And if you have questions or need assistance, please email our Beyond the Basics contact email at beyondthebasics@cbpp.org. And with that, we'll bring today's webinar to a close. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today.